Hello, sir. I'm very, very delighted to have you here. I myself am an aspiring journalist, so this is like one of the best things ever. So, I'll ask you minimum of 4 questions.
Okay.
That's it. I'm sure you're very tired from all the questions that we asked you. The session, you made a clear distinction between accountable journalism and then there's online journalism. So, you perhaps have been born and worked through the journalism that was accountable. But we have journalism that is news is just made to be put out there, doesn't have to be newsworthy. So how do we find our ways into accountable journalism when all we see now is just news that's just there because people need traction? Like how do I know you can't answer everything, like hum kaise karenge, but how do we find ourselves? Is there a right path to take, a higher road to accountable media?
See, one thing is accountable media, that is a different thing. We have a term called accountability media, which basically means those media houses, outlets, practices, that include online, which are which hold their news accountable to by themselves, put it to a higher standard so that all the other elements that go into making good news stories, news gathering, are put in place. As I have seen through my career, it's getting more and more overtaken by technology, and after the internet and all that, and Google and YouTube, transmission is very easy. And the problem with it being easy to transmit also is the problem very often that youngsters or lots of aspiring journalists, they do not put all the checks and balances in place because, like you said, it's very important to put out the news. Now the problem, that is where it stops being accountable. Yeah. So if you were to do, like I said in that class, if you were to actually start doing even covering stuff in your area where you live, there are always, there's a stray dog issue, or there is potholes, or there are children's security. Is it a child-friendly area? Is the park child-friendly? You can find lots of issues which can be addressed. If you were to decide, let's say, is this society's park child friendly? What are the things you're going to do? Don't talk only to two kids, parents of two children who have come there and play. You need to talk to the watchman. You need to talk to the society, and being able to ask questions. Why is it that the swing is rusted, but you have not polished it? It could hurt a child. The thing is that what you bring into your questions will elicit the information that you want to get. That is how you realize how to reach relevance in your stories. And that would help you enter into accountable journalism, because anybody who's likely to assess your work can very easily see what effort you put in.
If I am a consumer of news, do you think it's my responsibility to assess the credibility of the news, or is it the journalists?
It's definitely your business, because it's like saying, if you want to marry, should I marry? Should I ask my parents or should I marry? Because the choice is yours, and it's not as if you were otherwise to decide your parents' version of marriage, and if that marriage goes bad, you can't say you did it. Same way with news. I mean, the thing about it is, do you have a sharp enough assessment of value of news, and which portals or which newspapers are more credible than the other? That is something you need to check out. Like, for example, for me, if I get some sensational news, I immediately go, if it's international news, I go to New York Times, or look at CNN or BBC. Are they also saying the same thing? I will not go to the guy who screams on the YouTube channel saying, "अरे यूक्रेन में चढ़ाई हो गई." खबर शायद मैंने वो पहले सुना होगा, but it's very necessary for me to cross-check. And that habit, the earlier you get, the better, because then you develop the critical faculty to assess everything: information, news, everything you assess in terms of its own quality and steadfastness rather than your perception of it or how it will affect things.
Do you think a journalist who's starting out into this world, should have something to fall back on? As in, if I am a business person, for example, I can always work in the corporate after. Do you think a journalist should have it in his mind that I need to have something to fall back on because this might not be the perfect road, or the road that always has your back in terms of finance, in terms of your reputation, in terms of everything? Do you think we should keep it in our minds that if this doesn't work out, I need something to fall back on?
When you start out, I don't think you need to, because you should understand whether you are a journalist or a welder or a wireman. Any work you do brings quality, adds quality to you. So even if you're a journalist and you want to go to a corporate job, the first 4 years you were a journalist and you decide now you want to go to a corporate job, your skill as a journalist should help in that job. There are lots of journalists who move between PR and journalism. And they also become more valuable for advertising agencies because journalists know how news is disseminated. So when you take that skill into an ad agency, they will use you for client servicing, and you will know already many of the journalists available. So you will be able to service your clients better by zeroing in on the precise reporter who covers the thing instead of just generally giving a press release, at the office. So everything feeds into everything else. If, as a journalist, if you're a good reader, etc., you could be a good writer because of constant writing if you're writing, or as a videographer, whether it's an audiovisual media. So, I mean, when you start off, usually one doesn't look at it as a second career. Give this a first shot, you'll presumably spend at least a few years, which can only add value to you, whichever job you do after that.
So we in the Constitution obviously have freedom of speech, and that applies to the press as well. But in my experience and what I think is, it's not the government that restricts. There are other, like if I want to break a story, the media house I work for won't necessarily find it the required story. So in your career, you've worked for Times, you've worked for India Express. Have you ever felt that this story needs to be out, but the media isn't allowing me to? What should I do? Like, have you ever been in that position? And if you have anything to say to other students who are in that position where they want to do a lot of things, but people who are restricting the freedom of speech is not the government, is the place that they work for, but they need that voice.
Pressure is something that goes to everybody. I mean, whether the media houses, and it might be from the government, in the sense, without the government telling the media house to be like this, because the media house doesn't want to upset them. So pressure is not necessarily something you call up and say, "Ye mat chhapna." Yeah, one. Second thing is, there are other elements also. Suppose you have a story against a very big industrialist, who is India's biggest industrialist. My paper might decide, if I publish this, it might harm my business. So he might decide to go back. Then there are other elements too. Like, for example, journalists have the option of moving away from one house to another. I work for this paper. The paper doesn't want to publish it because they are close to the person against whom the story is. Then you move to another paper, and which may not be. You have that option sometimes. The third thing is, a big story will always find its way out. It may not be your byline, but anything that affects many people, you can't suppress it for too long, artificially or proactively also. It eventually will spill out. So to that extent, the problem is, of course, the journalist who worked on it will be heartbroken. But that's, like I said, like in love or marriages or school bus rides. There's always an element of risk that you have to take.
So a journalist is generally expected to be righteous. Like, that person has to be right. There's a way, like the media expects them to be right. The audience expects them to be right. They rely on that person a lot. Have you ever in your career succumbed to politics that has benefited you?
No.
You've never. You've never
Never.
in your life.
Yeah.
And do you think that if you succumb to politics at a certain point, it'll benefit a journalist? Always taking the rightest road will not benefit you.
See, there are two things to it. You said always right. I thought the right of politics. I think right is what you mean is there's an obligation to be right or expect there's a credibility about journalism likely to be saying the truth. That's what you're saying. Now, succumbing to politics, yes, I mean you can succumb, but you have to then make a clean break. You know, I mean, like there are lots of journalists who become politicians, who become member of parliament, etc., gone on to become minister, but then they give up journalism. You can't do both because then there is a conflict of interest. No? Like there are journalists who give up journalism, and then when they join newspaper, they write opinion column on behalf of the government that they represent, which is fine. That's an opinion. It's not reportage. So that is the way you manage some kind of conflicts of interest has to be managed like that. That's the only way possible. Because you can't restrict a man saying you don't ever go to politics. That can't happen. I mean, instead of politics, you want to go to Bollywood. You can't stop them. It's an individual choice.
So accountability media has survived the onslaught of technology and television. So do you think that television has somehow hampered the whole concept of accountable media in this generation?
The word is tampered you use. No, I have a personal theory which is, unlike many other countries, India doesn't have what you call a tabloid press. And for some reason, by the time television arrived, television slipped into that space. And it started getting eyeballs because one of the advantages of radio or television is it doesn't need the viewers to be educated. So invariably you have you just have a wider audience. And the more wide the audience, more easy to get advertisements for the television channel. Now the problem is, for example, there are channels like BBC, for example. It's run by a trust, which is why it's never under doubt. There's a time, maybe before you, every time a big national news broke, people used to go to BBC radio to cross-check. Now people put the TV on thinking every news will be available there. But if you notice, like I said, there are not enough deep stories that television do. They're just looking for eyeballs and the lowest common denominator. And then they talk. It's more like radio play on television rather than news gathering. When have you seen a deep forensic reportage on television? It's a fantastic medium. But have you seen any kind of, there are lots of investigative stories, slots, for example, in The Insider, that movie I told you about, Michael Mann's Insider. Or there are 60 Minutes, is a very famous story, television slot, which is about journalism. Tell me anything like that in Indian television. There's not a single BBC's, Ted Koppel is American, but BBC's Tim Sebastian had a question hour, which was a fiery questioning of all world leaders, everybody. On TV, have you seen that here? No. We just had noise on television and pitting each against the other, and the television anchors taking sides, which is just about a no-no. This is an absolute blasphemy as a news person. It can work for opinion pieces, where you are affiliate, this is the opinion, and then you call people to discuss that opinion. That is a different story. But news, as you transmit news, you don't take side, which is not true of television anymore, largely at least.